thoughtful ideas and suggestions for guests and topics.
Events, programs, and student activities.
All the factors are useful.
And welcome to this week's segment of Dialogue Houston. I'm your host, Lawrence Payne. To our regular viewing audience, welcome. To those joining us perhaps for the first time here for HCC's TV Dialogue Houston, we're here now every week at Tuesday and Thursday, 6 a.m. and 6 p.m., 3 p.m. on Saturday afternoons. As always, in the top of the hour, let me thank you for your thoughtful calls, emails, and text messages concerning previous shows we've aired here on HCC's TV Dialogue Houston, where after all, this is your community affairs, public affairs show, now starting its wonderful 29th season. We're always grateful for you for your ideas and thoughts for subjects and guests to be covered, because we have such a wonderful arena of areas and issues in our city to cover, with such great leadership and people doing wonderful things that we love to highlight. And I inform you of the work that they're doing, the dedication, commitment, and accountability around these issues to help you then be more informed to get engaged. I have a great show planned for you today because it is one of those wonderful, rare things that we get to focus on, and I'm kind of going to build it up this way intentionally and purpose. I'm having someone on today that's going to share with you the gospel truth in 23 pages. Not often do you get the gospel truth in 23 pages, but we're going to do that today with our wonderful guest. Our guest is Dr. Johnnie Williams. She is she teaches strategic management. She's a professor of strategic management at Jesse Jones Business School at Texas Southern University. And her team have put together this wonderful document entitled Quantifying Racism. Quantifying Racism, looking at Texas Southern University and the University of Texas. Separate but equal. Disproportionality, yes. All those things that we know about in this conversation when you mention those two schools. So I'm just going to stop there. We know this phrase when I first came to Houston, phrase I heard mentioned by TSU, that it was a stepchild, to the University of Texas. Well, I'm going to stop there, and we're going to dive into this wonderful report that Dr. Williams is going to lead us through as to the reality of what we've all known and we all understood what's happening in the duality of the University of Texas and the Texas Southern University in juxtaposition to each other. Now to have it really quantified is a wonderful thing, because it's going to open up a great dialogue and discussion about not only what it is and how it is today, but more importantly, what should happen and how things should change for the future. Welcome, Dr. Williams.
Thank you very much, Larry.
I hope I did justice in the lead in.
You did?
Because I really want you to kind of just lay it out and just go through it kind of step by step. I'll interject a little bit here and there as we go. I've read the whole document. In fact, I read it about 1.5 now, because I saw I missed a few things when you read it the second time. And I wasn't being facetious when I mentioned that it is the gospel truth in 23 pages. I mean, y'all were able to distill it so that it's readable now by the public, which I think is important in any kind of academic endeavor. That is something that you can pick up and relatively read. I'll stop there.
Thank you, and I appreciate your time going through this and inviting me and this document to visit with you today. This document started this month will be about 3 years ago, when I was approached by Professor Marcia Johnson, who at the time was heading up the university, the Urban Research and Resource Center, the URRC. She wanted to look at the disparity between Texas Southern and the University of Texas, Austin, because the mandate in 1947, when Texas Southern was formed as a result of a lawsuit that had been filed by a student wanting to attend the University of Texas Law School. TSU was formed to be a university, an equivalent university of the first class. Yet when you looked at appropriations and enrollment, there was a great disparity between the two universities. One has truly become a university of the first class, whereas we didn't feel that TSU had been given that opportunity. So therein began the journey of trying to quantify what's the difference between these two universities.
And then in that journey, we all have heard the name of Herman Marion Sweat.
Yes.
And he was the person that filed the lawsuit, wanting to go to law school. And of course, the University of Texas Law School would not let him in. So we ended up forming a whole university to have one person allowed to attend law school, known back then as the Texas State University for Negroes, that is now
Right.
Texas Southern University. But in that 63-year journey later, the issue of inequality that you mentioned and now we're going to espouse on, things have really not changed in real dollars from then to now, has it?
No, really, in terms of what has happened, because the Supreme Court eventually ruled that the University of Texas needed to allow Mr. Sweat to attend the University of Texas Law School. And he did enroll in the law school there and did not finish, but did enroll. What happened to Texas Southern, however, was there was a hope and a dream at the time that Texas Southern was set up. And that hope and dream would be that being a university, an equivalent university of the first class, we would have had programs like such as engineering and a medical school. The medical school was actually put in the Texas Southern University budget in 1950, but any funding for it was removed thereafter. And part of the reason the funding was removed is because the legislature, realizing that they were not going to be able to circumvent allowing or prohibit African Americans from attending the University of Texas, given the Supreme Court ruling that the two universities would not be separate and equal, because any student attending Texas Southern's law school would not have the resources that a UT law school already had. They withdrew funding. The budget was reduced by about 40%. So there was never the realization of a medical school. The engineering school was postponed because Prairie View already had an engineering program. And what they found is that the engineering students, African American engineering students, were not able to find jobs. And over time, that budget differential or inequity became more pronounced. One of the driving forces around the late 40s and early 50s in terms of enrollment and funding was the GI Bill. The GI Bill allowed for funding which grew enrollment. And if you look at some of the graphs that are in the report, you can see that disparity occurring around the early 50s, driven by the fact that there was now funding for non-African Americans or for white males to attend college, whereas only about 10% of the African Americans who participated in World War II were allowed to attend college. And then those who were allowed to attend college were basically forced to attend HBCUs, or historically Black colleges and universities.
Let's dive a little deeper into that. If you really read this document, you can tell very clearly that equality never was the goal of the state of Texas. It had no intention in ever educating its Afro-American students to the full extent that it did its Anglo-Caucasian white students. And the goal was really to perpetrate racial segregation, but to do it in a way not as overtly as one would normally do it, but to do it in a way that was somewhat subtle. But nonetheless, the goal was the same. And that's still being played out today in many ways, is it not?
Absolutely. Absolutely, it is. It's being played out, uh, particularly when you look at the state of Texas funding formula. And that really gets to the crux of quantifying the racism that we looked at. And we looked at a 23-year period from 1989, I believe, to till 2019. If I remember correctly, I don't remember the exact dates and all the calculations, but it was a 23-year period that we looked at in terms of looking at the state funding. And the position has generally been, and I've looked at a number of universities' documents on state funding and looking at their strategies for maximizing state funding. The word is that the formula creates equity, and that by using the formula that's used to allocate funds for universities such as UT Austin and Texas Southern, there is equity using this formula. But we found that there was a big problem with that, and that it did not create equity. Much of the literature says that the formula isn't enrollment driven, and that's not true. We tested that. We tested the idea between the semester credit hours that are used in the formula with enrollment. When we looked at the relationship, the correlation or relationship between enrollment and student credit hours, there was a high correlation. I'm thinking it was around 90%, which basically says these two things are the same. So while they don't call it enrollment numbers, when you look at semester credit hours, you're looking at a measure that's so highly correlated with enrollment that you may as well call it enrollment. But they don't, and they didn't. But it is a primary driver. It is one of the major components in the formula calculations.
In 2021, well, let me back up a minute before I get to current. In 1951, when the Texas legislature defunded the university and defunded some of the major programs thought about having on campus, from the medical school to other things, we did end up with a pharmacy, school of pharmacy. What was the thinking behind totally defunding the university?
As best we can tell, the thinking was, well, we really don't need this school. Now, we were going to form this university so that we could channel these African American students into this university. But the Supreme Court decision came along and said, you can't do that. Separate but equal does not work. It had been in place for almost, I guess, about 75 years, but all of a sudden the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal is not a real thing. It does not work, which was the primary driver for forming TSU. And when that happened, the thought was, we don't need a Texas Southern University anymore. We don't need a school for Negroes.
So they allow it to limp along?
Yes.
From 1951 to the present time, actually.
That's correct.
And they still only have 4% of Black students at the University of Texas. So obviously the Black students of Texas are going somewhere, and it's not UT for lots of reasons, as we know. And so we're still coming to TSU and Prairie View because that's where we go. Or Houston, yes, Tillerson and Austin, or something else. But to say that there's not a need for a predominantly African American Black Negro university going back through history to educate that population, when you are not willing, as the primary, so to speak, university, to do anything to increase your enrollment or to recruit. Obviously, 4% out of 50,000 students tells one very clearly you're not serious about having persons of color, particularly African Americans, on your campus.
That's how we see it. And we see that there's still a role for historically Black colleges and universities such
A
as
major role,
Texas Southern.
yes.
There is. And when you get beyond the undergraduate level, today, you're seeing that 50% or more of your African American professionals are coming out of HBCUs today in
Yep.
2021, 2020, 21. So there's still a role, but financially, that's never been acknowledged, at least as far as TSU is concerned. Back in the 90s, as part of the Reconciliation Act, there was some activity by a number of HBCUs to sue their states for more equitable or for equitable treatment. And what came out of that was the settlement that was handled through the Office of Civil Rights. And it was through that Office of Civil Rights, or OCR money, that Texas Southern was able to really be able to present any graduate programs of significance. And that in the early 2000s, the university added several graduate programs, which really is where the money is if you look at the way the formula is structured.
Right.
When you look at Texas Southern, we have, I believe it's about 30 graduate programs, that's master's, specialist, and doctoral programs, compared to about 157 graduate programs offered by the University of Texas. And the formula is really biased toward that, toward graduate programs, and we are still graduating, I think about 24% of undergraduate, not Texas Southern, but HBCUs are graduating about 24% of African American undergraduates.
Even when we had a chance to help Negro and Black GIs coming back after the war, we played games with the GI Bill. Did we not?
Yes.
At TSU, allowing them to utilize their GI Bill. And that just seems to be another insult on top of injury to all that was going on. Tell us about that history, that period.
The interesting thing about the GI Bill is that if you look at the literature around the GI Bill and the things that it provided for, it didn't just provide for higher education training or training beyond high school. It provided for housing and a number of other things. And many reports say that it became a critical linchpin in building wealth in the middle class in this country. What they decided, and this came directly out of Jim Crow, in the South, well, the bill in general, but it was driven particularly by the legislators from the South. While it was a federal act, the Southern legislators wanted to have access to administer that bill at the local level, at the state level. And in that way, they were able to have more control and to have it conform to those Jim Crow rules and laws that were in place. Consequently, the GI Bill was administered in a way that disadvantaged African Americans at the time. They were not allowed, for the most part, to attend white universities. There were very few that were allowed to attend universities in general, and then they were only allowed to attend underfunded HBCUs. And beyond that, the few that were allowed to pursue and utilize the GI Bill were forced into training for menial jobs rather than allowed to go to HBCUs or to college in general. So the GI Bill was very pivotal And the way that it was administered was very different from many federal programs. And by allowing that to happen, it really disadvantaged African Americans. And it's been a generational effect.
Yes, yes. So, one could look at this study in many ways and realize that the intent of the state, being that it was a Confederate state, and some may try to say still is, but the intent of the state, because of its history and because of dealing with Black people throughout its history, has never made and exercised a good faith effort in figuring out a way to make sure that all of its citizens who were Black African American had access to quality education, and therefore figure out the formula and the funding mechanisms to ensure that that happens. We have played games with this from the beginning, and we're still doing so.
Absolutely.
So we got a little time left in this segment, because obviously you and I and Dr. Marcia and others are going to have to do a follow-up.
Okay.
But where in the time we have left, where are we now in 2021? What needs to happen going forward?
What our study showed was that there is, when you look at the formula and you apply that just to graduate programs only, we saw a $1.5 billion differential over a 23-year period. We only looked at fall semester. When you look at the impact that those funds have had in turn, or the lack of those funds have had, and look at something that's in economic theory called multiplier effect, it's a $15 billion loss to TSU and its surrounding communities, because graduate programs grow universities and communities through things such as licensing and small business establishment. So the challenge is, how do we begin to close that gap? I mean, we've begun a conversation as a result of this report to talk about how do we close that gap. Matter of fact, we have a meeting tomorrow. Now, part of the challenge has been, and the questions that have been raised are around TSU's leadership. Well, the board actually controls the president. The governor appoints the board of regents for each university. We feel like we need to begin with the board, our board of regents, in terms of, we have not had board of regents with the kind of resources that you might see at a UT or that you might see at a U of H. Our board members don't have jets and large corporations at their disposal where we can engage our students and they can create opportunities for our students. So we feel like the first level of work begins with the board. And with that, we need to have the board identify a strong president. And right now there's a search for a president. So we have a real opportunity now to capture that. And when we look at the university, we don't have any university-wide endowment programs. And I believe that we need to focus our resources such that we have these overarching goals that will persist regardless of the leadership that's in place, that are designed to fortify the university's academic programs. And we're talking about how that looks. And some of the things that we are saying is that we need to get back to who we were supposed to be, in the sense of being an urban university of the first class.
So let me, in a few minutes we have left, because I have to do a second one with you and others, and I want to give this some thought and maybe even look at how we can do a couple of shows on this, because I think we've hit on something that needs to be said. It's one of those things that kind of been there, people understood it, they talked about it, they kind of whispered about it, they challenged pieces of it over time, but to have it in a very concise, coherent way now, to be able to talk about not only the past, the present, but more importantly, the future, gives us a chance to begin to do all those things like we've talked about TSU over the year. Engage our alumni. We need to talk about developing and increasing our endowments, increasing our scholarships. We need to have, as you said, great leadership starting from the top, the president, and people assigned by the governor, whoever the governor may be, to assign people who care about the mission of Texas Southern University, can bear and bring resources to affect that mission of Texas Southern University, and to do it in a way that they've done for all the other schools in Texas, the only University of Texas, Texas A&M, and just go down the list.
That's
So
correct.
my closing question to you in about a minute to make that answer to the question is, what can the public do? What can citizens do, constituents do, who vote for all these people, including the legislatures who represent TSU? What can we do to help you in your mission?
We believe that the legislators need to allocate money or appropriate money to fix the problem, and that number will be large, necessarily larger than what's typically appropriated. And we need to have that done in a non-piecemeal way.
Yes.
So we need to ask our legislator to be willing to work with us to determine what they believe that number should be, given the quantitative approach that we've used, and negotiate that and give us that money in a reasonable, large lump sum way. And people who vote can ask their state legislators to support TSU in that way.
Dr. Williams, I just want to thank you for being with us on this segment of Dialogue Houston. You've been a wealth of information and knowledge. The report is one that everyone should pick up and put their hands on. When I was saying earlier, I wasn't teasing, the gospel truth in 23 pages. That allows you to really understand what is happening at TSU in the past, what is happening now in the present, but more importantly, what can happen in the future for one of our great historical Black universities, and how you can be part of it, how you can help, and you can help move this mission. We're going to pick this up in another date and segment 2 or part 2 of the discussion about TSU. And I think that these are the type of discussions going forward, more and more, in this post-George Floyd reality, about honesty and truth, about equity and equality, but inequities and all the things we talked about systematic racism, about go down the list of all of those issues. Those issues have impacted every aspect of Texas Southern University, not only currently, but from its inception, from the beginning in 1947, based primarily in our state of Texas, being admitted in as a Confederate state in 1845. All that goes back, everything is connected, everything is interdependent, interrelated, interconnected. Just follow the trail, but more importantly, as we always say in these cases, just follow the money. If you follow the money, you will always come to the answers that you're looking for. They tell me we have to get out of here for now. So I appreciate you again, Dr. Williams, for being on. Look forward to you joining us in future segments of Dialogue Houston. And as always, until then, stay safe, be well, and peace, power, and love.